He was the most notorious and brutal king that ever ruled over England. But did you know that someone stole the bones of King Henry VIII? The infamous Tudor monarch is buried today inside a small burial vault under the choir of St George's Chapel, within the walls of Windsor Castle. This is certainly not what Henry VIII wanted, as he dreamed of being buried inside of a huge, ornate and grand tomb that would have been the biggest ever built. When Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547, inside of his bedchambers in the Palace of Whitehall, his son Edward VI would succeed him as the King of England. But Henry left many instructions for his funeral, and for what would happen after his death, and he brought in a Regency Council to help Edward rule. But he also gave specific instructions for his son to have him buried alongside Edward's mother, Jane Seymour. He wanted to be laid to rest next to his third wife, who gave him his greatly desired male heir. But Henry throughout his reign brought chaos and a severe amount of horror to his kingdom. Around 70,000 people were executed during his roughly 4 decades on the throne, which was around 3% of the population. However, one plucky soldier, following the king's death and centuries later, would try to steal one of the bones of Henry VIII, and what he planned to do with this bone was shocking. Join us today as we look at the theft of the bones of Henry VIII, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. After the death of King Henry VIII, the king's body was embalmed by the royal doctors and physicians. They removed the vital organs, as was traditional for kings and queens, and his body was cut open and his heart and vitals were placed inside of lead caskets and were buried away from the body. This was normal as mentioned, and to preserve Henry's body further, his cavity was then stuffed with spices to keep away decay and to preserve the remains in a better manner. It's believed that he would also have been wrapped in a cerecloth, a thick and heavy wax-dipped cloth, which shrouded the body almost like a mummy, but the effects of these cloths are remarkable, as still today it's considered that some medieval kings and queens have their remains intact because of this cloth and their embalming. Henry's body was then left in state inside the Palace of Whitehall, and specifically the presence chamber, before the funeral was to take place. The funeral procession for the king was huge and was lavish, much in keeping with the life of Henry VIII. It was a colossal 4 miles long from start to finish, and the funeral cortege was covered in black cloth, and on top of Henry's coffin was much of his royal regalia, including his orb and sceptre. Also on the coffin was a large life-sized effigy of Henry VIII, which was dressed in the king's clothes, which had been encrusted with jewels and riches. The people who saw the procession from Whitehall to Windsor were amazed at the pageantry, and for many, this effigy was the first time they'd ever seen an image of the man who had ruled over them for a long time. The procession continued towards Windsor, and the coffin was pulled by 4 huge horses, and it arrived at Syon Abbey for the night, and rested to allow the horses to have a break, and also for the officials to have a rest too. But whilst inside of the abbey, it's believed by some historians that Henry's remains may have exploded due to the shaking of the procession on the cobbled streets, and that gases built up following death were released by the motion. There is a legend that Henry's remains dripped from the bottom of the coffin at the abbey, and then that dogs licked at these horrific liquids that had gone onto the floor. But also, interestingly, this may have some legitimacy, as there was some damage caused to Henry's coffin, and this would later be exploited by the man who tried to steal some of his bones. The procession the next day continued towards Windsor, and when inside of Windsor Castle, the coffin of Henry VIII was carried by 16 strong yeomen of the guard, as it was very heavy. The funeral then took place, and the coffin of the notorious Tudor monarch was placed in the small burial vault alongside Jane Seymour's coffin under the choir in the heart of the chapel. Over the next few centuries, this burial vault was disturbed a number of times, as more people were added to the vault. It was a very small space, and still Henry VIII and his third wife are buried here today. But Charles I, the disgraced executed King of England and the Stuart King, was buried in the same vault. Following his execution and the loss of the English Civil War, Parliament believed that this would be a good place to bury Charles, as it was quiet and would prevent his remains being dug up by royalist supporters. Being buried next to a Stuart monarch would have infuriated Henry VIII, as he would declare war on them a number of times throughout his reign, and it would also ban the Stuarts from ever becoming kings and queens of England. but this did occur following the death of Henry's daughter Elizabeth I, who had no children or heir. But when the coffin of Charles I was placed inside of the vault, the workers had to move Henry VIII's grand and huge coffin, but they noticed that this coffin was in a bad way and had been damaged rather significantly. The tomb, when it was opened in 1649 and surveyed, was said to have been in a very bad way, and that the coffin of Henry VIII was already a wreck, and the exterior wooden coffin was in bits and had broken. Also, it was said that the inner lead-lined coffin, containing Henry's actual body, looked as if it had been beaten in with violence about the middle, meaning it was very dented. But this could have been caused by someone breaking into the vault before and damaging it, or by further damage caused by Henry's decaying corpse from within. However, it was said during this survey that Henry VIII's skeleton, and his skull in particular, could be seen and was visible, and it was said that his skull had traces of his beard, meaning that for some time his remains had been exposed to the air and the elements and had been in some state of decay. By using the word skull, it's likely that Henry's head and skin had already decayed, except from parts near his mouth where his beard could be seen. But this mess was a sharp contrast with the remains of Jane Seymour, his third wife, which was said to have been in perfect condition, and the coffin looked as fresh as the day as it was made. There are no records that state that Henry VIII's coffin was ever repaired, so we must assume that still today his decaying remains are exposed to the elements, underneath the feet of thousands of tourists who visit Windsor Castle every single day. He was also not placed inside of a new coffin, as this would have been recorded and would be inside of the inventory of the chapel. Also, it's likely that the monarchy would have to have signed off on this too. However, there was a shocking record of a foot soldier that stole one of the bones of Henry VIII, and the state of Henry's coffin and body led to him being able to take advantage of the remains of the deceased Tudor king. It was said in an account that the sexton did his best to clear the chapel. Nevertheless, Isaac, the selections man, said that a foot soldier had hid himself so as he was not discerned, and being greedy of prey, crept into the vault and cut so much of the velvet pall that covered the great body, as he judged would hardly be missed, and wimpled out through a hole through the said pall that covered the great body, and wimpled out also a hole through the said coffin that was the largest, probably fancying that there was something well worth his adventure. The section at his opening the door espied the sacrilegious person, who being searched, a bone was found about him, with which he said he would haft a knife. The governor, being therefore informed of him, gave him his reward, and the lords and others present were convinced that a real body was in the great coffin, with some before having scrupled. The body which is referred to inside of the great coffin, or the large coffin, is that of King Henry VIII, and it was recorded that his coffin was very big, and is certainly the largest inside of the vault. With this account, it states that a foot soldier broke into the burial vault of Henry VIII, then put a hole inside of the large decaying coffin, and then he reached into the coffin and stole one of Henry VIII's bones. He said that he wanted to use this bone or bones to make a handle for a knife, which is shocking. But the theft was discovered, and it's believed that the bone would then have been placed back in the coffin. The coffin and vault of Henry VIII would be opened many more times, including to inter one of Queen Anne's deceased children, but after being lost to time in 1813, it was rediscovered. The vault of Henry VIII and Charles I was then explored and documented by Sir Henry Halford, and he claimed that the discovery of the vault was made by accident during building work. But with this they looked at the body of Henry VIII through the holes in his coffin, but they were more focused on the coffin next to him, to the right. They were more interested in checking that the body of King Charles I was actually inside of the coffin, and they found inside of this the headless corpse of Charles, along with his head, which had fallen off the body after the twine, used to sew it back on following execution, had disintegrated. But this was the last time in which the vault was opened. The shocking story of the man who tried to steal the bones of King Henry VIII is one which is not the most well known. However, still today it's believed that his remains have been exposed to the elements, and that they may be decaying. The holes made in the coffin, along with the damage, would have sped up the decaying process with regards to Henry's body, regardless of the cerecloth protecting it. It's most likely that inside of the coffin today, 500 years after his death, are just a collection of Henry VIII's bones. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.